ENG103, which covers literary analysis. You'll find that there are a handful of videos because this particular one is going to be an overview of what we're doing in session 3, but there are other videos covering the concept of a literary analysis and specifically the stories that we are working on in this course. So look out for all of those for different and varied content. Hopefully not too much of it is sort of overlapping. And apologies if there is some background noise as someone, namely a bulldog, is taking a nap. So what we have today are, of course, our topic and outcomes, what we need to be reading and reviewing, and then our assignments, so our discussion, our paper, and our quiz. So topic outcomes this particular week, we're looking at responding to literature. This is something that we're doing a lot of times. However, actually talking about it and actually processing what we call these concepts is a little bit different. So more often than not, your friends say, well, what did you think of that movie or book? And you give them a synopsis. But that's probably not how you're thinking about it. You're just doing it because it makes sense and it's useful. And then you're paraphrasing what you've seen or experienced. So these are not new. They're things you're doing. However, talking about them in this way and sharing them in this way is the new part. Our outcomes is that we hope we'll be able to explain the key elements and themes of a literary work. We're going to look at words like critique and analysis, which can feel a little negative, but they really shouldn't be. A good critique, a good analysis is about asking interesting, in-depth questions. It should never be something hurtful or negative or sad. It should be really exciting because we're getting really into the meat of what we're exploring. And of course, we're always working on our APA formatting and being effective writers. We're wanting to get as much practice in as we can. Reading and viewing. You're going to see 2 or 3 or 4 of these PDFs this time. I don't want you to think about all of them as something that you have to seriously, deeply review, but a lot of them are here for you to have sort of a jumping off point. So especially when we're looking at literary terms and the other 10 important literary terms, it's giving you a space to say, those are some questions that could be useful or ideas that I can explore. Having them beside me could be useful or engaging when I'm working with a text. Of course, this one is what we're going to base our quiz off of. So there are some questions at the end of this particular PowerPoint that you may want to be thinking about and highlighting as you look at that particular PDF. And of course, we're going to have 2 short stories. You get to pick which one you'd like to look at. And of course, there's a bit of an overview in the literary analysis PowerPoint alone about the stories. I will say that the necklace is translated from Guy de Maupassant's French version, and we're looking essentially at borrowing gone wrong and questions about how we choose to relate to other people and how we choose to see our lives. The Gift of the Magi is probably one you've experienced in some form or other because it's a very famous, popular story by O. Henry. It's a little bit newer than Maupassant's, and so I think of it as sort of more of a fun one. The title here is a big clue about sort of the concept. If you're thinking about the Magi, those are the wise men. So if you remember the 3 wise men in the Bible who come to Jesus and bring him gifts, that's what we're going to be sort of the undercurrent, a theme within it, is the gifts that the Magi gave and what purpose those had, but played out with a young couple at the turn of the century. But those ideas are going to be covered. And of course, we have our biblical perspective. But what I love about this one is that it's encouraging us to take these ideas about analyzing literature and apply them to something that we, again, have probably heard before. But this time, we're going to reflect on the images that we're going to see. Look for things where we see, feel, taste, smell. Oops, and a note to self. Look for the senses. What are you seeing? What are you tasting? What do you feel? What do you hear in these kinds of poems? Because it is a poem as well as a Bible verse. So look for those things and ask what they're doing for us. So when we get things like overflowing or the darkest valley, so darkness, those kinds of things are there for a purpose. Now let's head into what we're working on. So our assignment and our discussion is going to be parallel with reading and writing about literature, the same way that we're going to be looking at this information for the quiz. So it's a great way to remember that you're overlapping these two ideas. So our specific questions are, in what types of writing have you used these skills in the past? We're going to be looking at transferable skills, and how will we continue to develop those skills? So we're looking at what we're writing and how we write, and how maybe writing about stuff like literature could actually be helpful to our profession, our ministry, our personal goals, maybe even connecting with family and friends. So let's go explore that. What do we mean when we say these transferable skills? What kind of concepts are we looking at? These are sort of narrowing it down. I'm taking them from the reading that we're doing and focusing on these four, but I want you to remember that I'm just giving you a handful focused on the reading. There are loads more examples that you too could pick, and so I don't want you to feel like, oh, well, I have to pick from these four. You are more than welcome to go with what you feel you're learning or something that has impacted you. But in terms of the reading, we're going to go with previewing, highlighting, annotating, and looking for the purpose. So let's start by looking at previewing. Again, you may already be using some of these things, you just haven't thought about them in these sort of terms or with this language. A lot of times when we start to read in elementary school or middle school, there are questions that we are given, and that's how we start to process what we read. So previewing often encourages, according to our reading, these kinds of questions. What is it? What's happening? And what is the purpose? And then we can ask questions like, well, were my expectations met or exceeded or completely wrong? Which can definitely happen. Well, I often encourage these three questions for when we're reading literature. What does it say? That's our synopsis or summary. How does it say it? That's not quite the same as this, but we're looking at genre. Is it a short story? Is it a Bible verse? Is it a movie? And we're looking at style as well. Is it postmodern? Is it immigrant literature? We're looking at all of those pieces as well as building blocks. What kind of plot does it have? What kind of characters does it have? And finally, what does it mean? So you've been doing this one all the time. You're already interacting with that. You're definitely taking the theme and understanding from what you're reading, and you probably understand a lot of this. You just aren't using the language that we're using, the jargon of talking about literature. So these aren't precisely new, but how we're talking about them, again, could be a little bit new. And we are simply looking to have stronger language for all of it so that we can communicate effectively. Highlighting is a super cool one. Obviously, you can use a pencil and you can circle and draw and mark, but you can also look for a highlighter itself. You can also use the tools that come with a PDF reader where you can underline again and box and circle and all of that. But essentially, we're looking at how we can connect. I personally don't use highlighters because I really respond to all the colors, and then I only look at the colors and I forget to look at the words. So highlighting is the reverse of helpful for me. But that's something I learned by trying it. I thought highlighting was amazing, and then I realized all I was doing was coloring, and that I wasn't really effectively utilizing these ideas. So explore it for yourself. Does it really make a lot of sense? Does each color really help draw you to, for instance, certain words or language or how you're approaching it? Or are you on that far into the spectrum with me where you just end up coloring? But we're looking for words and concepts. We're going to do the same thing essentially that we're doing with annotating. And one form of that annotating, which could also be highlighting, is reading with our pencil. So you can start with a wonderful sort of description, and these, as you can tell, things like circling and underlining, those matched what we did with highlighting. That doing that with a highlighter or a pencil, both of those can work. But we sometimes have strategies that can help us. I do this with my work. I will put stars when I want to use a quote. Instead of underlining everything, I may draw a line to the side of it. I ask questions. And sometimes, yes, I use sort of shorthand that only refers to things that I know about. But I use a lot of those same features. So what is better for you? Is it using a pencil? Is it using sticky notes? Is it using a highlighter? My husband uses a red pencil because that really, really helps him. So look for those kinds of things, try them out, and see what works for you. And all of this is to say what kind of things work across the board. So the same skills that I bring to my academic work, I do this to your work as my profession. I do this for my own personal work when I'm trying to process or understand. So I'm transferring something like annotating to all the different areas of my life. Another way to look at annotating, which I sometimes talk about in class, is an annotated bibliography. So here's a great link to the OWL at Purdue, which talks about it. But what we can do after we've read and we've previewed and we've highlighted and we've done some beginning annotations, then we can write about it. Sometimes I write a sentence or two. Sometimes I write page after page. I may save my reaction, so we can often forget what we initially felt. Or I may say what I thought it was going to be and what it actually turned out to be. I often write about how I feel I can use that for my own work, for sharing with students, for increasing my knowledge. And of course, I love sharing quotes that I have found to be interesting or useful. A big part of this is that I like to type it because it creates a searchable database for me. So when a particular word comes up or a particular idea, I know that because I've written these different things, especially quotes, that I can type that into my computer search engine and boom, I often find the pieces I'm looking for. So all of these things, again, are for seeing what works for you in terms of saving information, processing information, and feeling like you're really getting something out of what you're reading. So yes, it may look a little different from what you're reading for a Bible study versus what you're reading for class. But at the same time, a lot of these skills are things that once you figure out what is really meaningful to you, you can use it in all these different places. So we're just playing with it and testing it and seeing. So now we're here for purpose. When we look at what we're writing, we also can realize that other people are thinking these same things. If I'm writing to interpret this story, couldn't another person also write to interpret another story and then I can take some meaning from that? So essentially, whatever we do in writing is probably something that lots of authors are doing as well. And we can turn it back around and say, well, if I wrote for this reason, could that person also write for that reason? So, for instance, here, writing to respond. We want to discover and express our reactions. That is essentially an annotated bibliography. We're engaging in relatively informal activities. We're brainstorming and journal writing to see what we're taking out of that text and idea. When we're writing to evaluate, we want to make sure that we're assessing the literary merits. We're assessing what works and what didn't work and how we feel about that. So these things are specific to writing about literature, but could they maybe be useful elsewhere as well? So now let's turn to look specifically at a literary analysis. This is another one of our samples, our PDFs that we're looking at, and it's just asking us encouraging points. We don't have to fill this out in terms of, okay, question one, characterization. What does that mean? What am I doing? Instead, we're just saying, well, which one of these sort of seems to help me? Perhaps understanding the plot could make better sense to me for the gift of the Magi. Perhaps looking at the purpose of this story could help me with the necklace. A lot of things that we look at for literature are about having a toolbox, and then we take that toolbox and we say, which tools actually work for this particular story? So we're looking for that bigger picture, we're asking those questions, but don't feel badly if one or more just doesn't seem to connect for the story you're looking at. And for our quiz, so some of these things will fit as well into our quiz as they do into what we're actually writing about and how we're processing the story that we choose from the two we get to read. So don't forget those elements. Make sure you're looking at all of it for connecting all of those dots. So some things that we're going to be asking are, well, what do we gain if we're analyzing literature and analyzing what we read? And what are the purposes and points of what we have read? Why would someone do this? So a lot of these questions are going to be useful as you look at writing for your discussion and you say, well, what am I using? What is my intention and purpose, and how do these things help or support me? You're also going to be asking that about the writers of the stories we're looking at, and you're saying, well, how is that writer doing some of these things, and how is it sort of working or perhaps not working? And finally, let's look at that quiz and see what kinds of questions it wants us to explore. As you read, especially that reading and writing chapter 2 sample, I want you to be thinking about these questions. If we're analyzing the structure, should I also explore the writer? Could I find information within a text about a writer? For instance, do we write about what we know? Do we often share locations that we're familiar with? Literary analysis can help to reveal what sorts of things. Is it about logic? Is it about how well we're communicating? What about this characterization thing? What does that encompass? What does it mean? How is it more or less than a character? This idea of characterization. What is mood? Mood and tone are both four-letter simple words, but maybe they mean something quite different, and I should know the difference. What is style? What do we mean by that? I know that like my outfit could be in a 70s style, but what does it mean in terms of a story or a literary analysis or what we are reading in general? And if we go look at some of our key details, what about things like highlighting? What does it involve? And our last four, what's the purpose of literary analysis? What's the big picture? How do we define things like purpose? Is it vague or concrete? Can we give it a very specific definition? And how do we support a topic? What do you do with evidence? How do you fit that evidence in? And finally, is proofreading important? So as you read, let me find this example. PDF that we have, Reading and Writing About Literature. Look for those terms and ideas. Remember that you can often download it as a PDF. And what is a PDF? If not, searchable. So make sure you have that find button. And remember that if a quiz does not say you must do this on lockdown browser completely alone with no notes, then it is saying we can use notes. But we want to make sure that those notes are things that we process and understand and that are usable. Is it better for you to have notes that you've handwritten yourself where you've taken key details? Is it better for you to have a PDF that's searchable? Ask these questions before you start a quiz.